Okay, welcome. Welcome to the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center's program to mark the anniversary of Justice Robert Jackson's closing statements at the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg in July of 1946. My name is Thorin Tritter. I'm the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, which is located in beautiful Glen Cove, New York. As many of you may know, our mission is not only to teach about the history of the Holocaust, but to combat racism and all manifestations of intolerance, and also to promote resistance to prejudice. Today, we draw attention to the Nuremberg Trials, not only as an effort to bring justice and closure after the Holocaust, but as a foundational moment in the creation of international human rights law, when the world came together to make clear that certain behavior is just not acceptable, regardless of what an individual dictator may claim, and that there are certain crimes which are abhorrent to humanity. The International Military Tribunal of 1945 and 1946 became the basis for subsequent trials in Nuremberg, but also for the establishment of the International Criminal Court, with jurisdiction to prosecute individuals for the international crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. To tell us more about the significance of the Nuremberg trials and to share insights about the closing arguments made by Chief American Prosecutor Justice Robert H. Jackson, I'm delighted to welcome Professor John Barrett. Here he is. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
Professor Barrett is one of, if not the leading American scholar on Robert Jackson and the Nuremberg trials. A graduate of Georgetown and Harvard Law School, he is one of the most well-known legal historians in the country, who now serves as a professor of law at St. John's University and is the Elizabeth S. Lena Fellow at the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York, where he's also a board member. Professor Barrett has published widely about Justice Jackson and the Nuremberg trials and is a frequent speaker, lecturer, and commentator on legal history topics. While he works on writing a biography of U.S. Supreme Court Justice and Nuremberg prosecutor Robert H. Jackson, Professor Barrett has almost single-handedly kept Jackson's achievements in the public eye through his regular Jackson List emails. I'm not sure if any of you, or maybe all of you, are already on his list. He now reaches over 100,000 people with his emails about Justice Jackson. We're honored to have Professor Barrett with us to mark this anniversary, and I personally look forward to hearing his insights into the events that unfolded 74 years ago this week in Nuremberg. And so with that, Professor Barrett, please, welcome.
Thank you so much, Thorin, and thank you to everyone who is out there. This is an odd time and a challenging time, of course, and I do a lot of teaching and lecturing. I've had the privilege to participate in the past in programs at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County, but in person, when I can read faces and see eyeballs and field questions directly. This is a different format, but I trust you're out there, and I'm glad you're out there, and I look forward to the Q&A portion at the end of this talk so that we can engage through Thorin, reading questions off the chat board and have a little bit of direct exchange. As he said, I am a professor at St. John's University in Queens, New York, and I am a biographer of Robert H. Jackson. Jackson was a Pennsylvania native, raised in New York State, a Western New York lawyer, a leader in private practice, and then in the 1930s went to Washington and joined the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt. And he rose like something of a meteor through the New Deal in the 1930s into the early 1940s. He was a senior official at the Treasury Department, then in the Justice Department, climbed the ladder, became the Solicitor General of the United States, the government's principal advocate before the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1940, Jackson became the U.S. Attorney General, and in 1941, he was appointed to the Supreme Court of the United States. So he is Justice Jackson. He is a leading American law figure. But on top of all of those achievements, he is most remembered and most renowned for the challenging assignment that he received in 1945, which was to be the American Chief of Counsel, which became the American Chief Prosecutor of the captured Nazi leaders for the international crimes they had committed in starting and waging World War II. And that proceeding happened at Nuremberg. That is the one and only international Nuremberg trial. It began in the fall of 1945, and 8 months later, by July 26, 1946, so 74 years plus 1 day ago, Robert Jackson gave his closing argument at the Nuremberg trials. And that's the focus of this presentation. I want to see here. I want to show you Jackson at the podium here at Nuremberg. There are many still photographs, and there are some moving pictures. I'm going to show you a little bit of film in a little bit.
John, we seem to have lost your photo, your image. Did you hit stop video by any chance by accident?
I might have. Am I
there
back?
we go. You're good.
Okay. So this is Jackson at the podium on July 26, 1946. The tell among the many Nuremberg photographs is the dotted tie pattern that he's wearing, which, as far as I've been able to determine, he's never worn at any other point in the trial. So this is his closing argument tie, and maybe it was a lucky tie. I'll also show you a participant or a witness who was there, who was only there for this day, and that's the other tell that allows you to be sure you're looking at a photograph or a film of this day. So Jackson sums up the American case on July 26, 1946. But before we jump into the detail of that, we need to do some groundwork to explain a little bit of him and a little bit of this assignment and how the path had been traveled to get to this end stage of the Nuremberg trial. This is Jackson at the US Supreme Court a little more than a year earlier. It's May 2nd, 1945. He's not wearing his robe. Justices only wear their robes on the bench. He's posing in one of the court's conference rooms for an official press event because he has just been unveiled as President Truman's appointee to be the US Chief of Counsel for the prosecution of Axis war criminals in the European theater. That's a long title, a big mouthful. It means Nazi war criminals. Harry Truman was the new president of the United States. Roosevelt had died on April 12, 1945. Vice President Truman inherits this desk, this office, and the impending Allied victory in the European theater. The Pacific theater was going to take some additional months. And one of the commitments that the big three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, had made across the years of the war was that once the victory was won, they together would hold the arch criminals of Nazism responsible through an international process. That is a vague, high-level commitment, and it's focused on a very small, select top-of-the-pyramid group. It meant Hitler and his inner circle, and then descending down a pyramid, additional rungs below them. These were people whose acts were regarded as criminal, as against international norms, international values, and international treaties, including ones that Germany had subscribed to in the years before the Nazis took power. And these were crimes that didn't have any particular venue. An individual atrocity can be prosecuted in the location where it occurs. Some soldier or commander directs the murder of surrendering prisoners. That's a war crime. That's an international crime. That's a treaty violation, but it happens in a particular spot. These arch criminals, the leadership of the Nazis, who had planned and then waged the war of aggression and perpetrated all the atrocities that occurred in that context, didn't commit crimes in any particular venue. So that is the task that the big three have committed to handling together, that Truman has inherited as his new presidential responsibility, and for which he needs a crackerjack lawyer. And so in late April 1945, Truman reaches out to the man who was, by general American opinion, acclaim, experience, etc., the best lawyer in the country, the lawyer for the hardest problem, a gifted trial and appellate advocate, Robert H. Jackson. He was a sitting U.S. Supreme Court justice, and by our separation of powers instincts, that's an odd recruitment, if you will. But things were looser in those days. Justices did more extrajudicial assignments, and the moment on the calendar was propitious, because in late April 1945, as Truman is needing his chief of counsel, the Supreme Court term is coming to an end. Jackson, a brilliant and very autonomous writer, had largely completed his work for the Supreme Court's term, and the president is asking him to take on this unprecedented and enormously important responsibility. Jackson, as a matter of patriotism, as a matter, I think, of the attraction of the job to any lawyer, and as a matter of his own workload, is available and says yes. It turns out that this job, which Truman was pitching as a summer recess job, and you, Jackson, can be back on the Supreme Court by the fall of 1945, maybe a little bit late, but you'll be back, takes a whole year. So Jackson misses the entire next term of the Supreme Court because he is U.S. Chief of Counsel, serving the president, working in the executive branch, being the chief U.S. prosecutor. This is a letter from Truman's assistant, Matt Connolly, sending to Jackson the executive order, May 2nd, 1945, appointing Jackson. On Truman's part, this was brilliant, not only as staffing, but as a toss of the hot potato, because now really it is Jackson's problem to figure out how to do this, to prepare to do this, and to do this on behalf of the United States. And by appointing Jackson, Truman has gone first among the Allies, and that encourages the UK and the USSR and France each to also appoint premier talent to staff their national commitment to this international project. The first phase, before we get to Nuremberg, occurred in London. This is a building on the grounds of Westminster Abbey called Church House. It is a headquarters building of the Church of England. If one stands under those arched doorways, the next time one can travel to London, and looks out, that's Westminster Abbey. So you see, we're located in the heart of London. And what happens in Church House in the summer of 1945 is these four Allied nations that have together won the war, defeated the Nazis, obtained their unconditional surrender, and obtained physical custody of the landmass that had been Nazi Germany, because the Nazis have surrendered unconditionally, is a negotiation about how to do this together across differing legal systems. You see Robert Jackson on the right side of the photograph wearing the bow tie. To his right is General William J. Donovan, Wild Bill Donovan, the head of the OSS, who was Jackson's deputy for the first phase of this project. That's the US side of the table. Opposite the Americans on the left is the French side of the table. Facing the camera is the United Kingdom side of the table. And with their backs to the camera are the Soviet Union representatives at this table. And they have a lot to hammer out because these are differing legal systems. But across the summer of 1945, so now 75 years ago at this point, literally, they hammer out an agreement to create the world's first international criminal court. It's called the International Military Tribunal because it is a tool of and a function of military occupation. The Nazis have unconditionally surrendered to the Allied military. There is no peace treaty. There is no successor Germany. So this is executive action in the military sphere of activity after the fighting has ended. Here's Jackson inking it on behalf of the United States. To his right is the Lord Chancellor of the UK, and to Jackson's left is the representative of France. Jackson briefly returns to the United States in September of 1945 to explain to his boss, his appointing authority, President Truman, what they have agreed to and how this is going to work. And Truman is incredibly satisfied, and to the extent Jackson was allowing Truman to take custody of the hot potato, Truman tosses it right back to Jackson. This International Military Tribunal is a four-nation court. It's got a principal judge and an assistant judge from each of the four nations. It's got jurisdiction over 4 international crimes: the crime of conspiracy, the crime of breaching the peace or waging aggressive war, war crimes in violation of the Hague Treaties and other international commitments about the proper way to fight war, and crimes against humanity, the generative force that Thorin mentioned in his introduction that becomes really the birth of modern human rights law, Genocide Convention, and other developments that have followed that. Its jurisdiction to hear allied charges against individuals and organizations that have committed one or more of those crimes is a 1-year experiment. It can be renewed by agreement of the Allies, but this will be a first Nuremberg trial, and we'll see what comes after this. Its procedures are generally along an American due process model. The defendants have a right to the written charges against them. They have a right to evidence to defend themselves, including witnesses. They have the right to defense counsel and counsel of choice. They have the right to liberal documentary discovery, and they have the right to a public proceeding. So we're in August and September of 1945, and in a very short order, this trial finds its location and begins. The location is Nuremberg, in the southeast quadrant of what had been Nazi Germany. It's about 100 kilometers north of Munich to locate you. It's in the American sector of occupation. And although the center old city, the Altstadt in Nuremberg, had been bombed by the Allies to smithereens, on the outskirts of Nuremberg, on this road connecting Nuremberg to the adjacent city of Fürth, is a combined courthouse and prison complex that is largely intact. This is the Palace of Justice. This is where the Nuremberg trial and successor American Nuremberg trials occurs. You see the courthouse building in the front, and you see the wheel and spoke design behind it. That is the prison and its various wings. That's the front of the Palace of Justice. You can see it had taken a bomb hit. It was not an undamaged building. To the right side, this is an annex connected that also had suffered significant roof damage, but it's been patched. You see the American Army vehicles and the American soldiers on patrol. And you see 4 big square windows on what we would call the 3rd floor. That is the courtroom that becomes the site of the Nuremberg trial. That's courtroom 600. So those 4 windows are the room in which it happens. This is the interior view of courtroom 600 after it's been fixed up and reconstructed, architecturally reconfigured to host this International Military Tribunal. On the right side are the defendants. 24 surviving principal Nazis were indicted by the Allies in October of 1945. It, of course, does not include Hitler, nor Goebbels, nor Himmler, all of whom were dead. It does not include Adolf Eichmann, who is a known significant figure but is believed to be dead. It includes in absentia Martin Bormann, who they believe might be alive and a fugitive, and then representatives of the sectors of Nazi leadership and perpetration. So Hitler's number 2, Hermann Goering, the Reichsmarshal, his number 3, Rudolf Hess, his foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, General Keitel, head of the Wehrmacht, the economics minister, Helmar Schacht, the minister of war production, Albert Speer, the propagandist anti-Semite, Julius Streicher, and others make up this dock. Those are the 2 rows on the far right. The 2 tables in front of them are their defense counsel, the attorneys they had each selected and asked for, who were brought to Nuremberg, who were paid by the Allies, who were able to defend them in this public proceeding. Across from them are 2 rows of assistants, and behind them on a high bench, mostly obscured, are the 8 judges who function as a court of 8 for this proceeding. The camera is above the witness stand, and we are looking out on 5 prosecution tables. On the far right is the table of the French prosecutors. On the next in toward the center is the Soviet prosecutors. The center table is the American prosecutors, so Robert Jackson and team at that table. And next to the left is the British table. The 5th table is a kind of overflow seating for others who needed to be or wanted to be in there. And then behind you have seating for staff and public, and in the balcony for VIP visitors and press. You can see the bright Klieg lights, the kettle lights on the ceiling. That was to facilitate filming, although film was expensive. And I think the sense of history wanting film was not quite what we would wish it to be. So although this trial took 8 months, less than 50 hours of it were actually filmed. It was all, of course, transcribed, and those transcripts are the basis for our knowledge. It was reported in lots of print, but not so much filming, some still photography, is the Nuremberg record. This jumping to the end of the trial is July 26, 1946. 8 months earlier, Jackson had opened the case on November 21, 1945, and it went through prosecution cases by each of the four nations, the US, the UK, then the Soviets, then the French, and division of responsibility. The defendants each then got to put on a case, and many of them took the stand in their own defense and also called witnesses. Now, by the summer of 1946, the Allied chief prosecutors are ready to sum up. And so you see Robert Jackson standing with his hands crossed in front of him, preparing to come to the podium, wearing that lucky tie. They've risen because the judges are taking the bench. The tell that we're looking at July 26 is that directly behind Jackson, in a slightly lighter colored suit with a dark tie, with a tall bearing, and if it was a Zoom photo, a very handsome face, is an executive branch official, Stuart Symington, who later went on to become a US Senator from Missouri, who as a War Department official was visiting occupied former Nazi Germany and came to see the Nuremberg trial on one day, July 26, 1946. So when you see Stuart Symington at the table, you are looking at this day. He's just there as a spectator, but because he's War Department and senior, he gets to sit right behind Robert Jackson. Across from Jackson is Thomas Dodd, Jackson's executive trial counsel, his in-court, everyday lead prosecutor and manager. Dodd went on to become a US Senator from the state of Connecticut and served a number of terms and had an illustrious career. Behind him is a senior prosecutor, John Harlan Amen, who had been a mob prosecutor in Brooklyn of Murder, Inc., and was a central player on this prosecution team. He's in the light uniform. Behind Amen is a German Jewish refugee lawyer who returned to become a member of this prosecution team, Robert Kempner. And arrayed in the room is a range of other talent. Jackson goes, this is a close-up zoom of the same photo, gives you a little bit better view of Symington, Dodd, Amen. And in the British table, you see the bald fellow on the left. That's Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, who was the equivalent of Dodd, the day-to-day chief prosecutor in the courtroom for the UK, although the chief of counsel was the Attorney General, Hartley Shawcross. We'll see him in a subsequent photo, but he had a full-time job in London, so he was in and out of Nuremberg, a bit of a commuter. The podium is empty because that's where Jackson's about to go to give his closing argument. Next to the empty podium is Jackson's executive assistant, his own son, William E. Jackson, who was a lieutenant junior grade in the US Navy, 26 years old, a graduate of Harvard Law School, and really functioning as his father's law clerk for this project. To Bill Jackson's right is Jackson's executive secretary, Mrs. Elsie Douglas. They are part of the inner office, and they are there to sort of help Jackson with documents and text as he gives the closing argument. This is now Jackson at the podium. You can see the judges on the bench, at least most of them. This is a close-up or a direct view of the 8 of them. You have 2 Soviet judges on the left, 2 British judges next to them, including the bald fellow who was the president of the tribunal, Sir Geoffrey Lawrence, 2 American judges next to them. Next to Lawrence is Francis Biddle, the former US Attorney General, who is the American judge. And next to him is US Circuit Court Judge John Parker of the 4th Circuit, who is the American alternate. And to the left of Judge Parker's left are the 2 French judges. The alternates were there to step in case one of the principal judges became ill or had to withdraw. That never happened, and 8 is more brain power than 4, so they sat like this, and they functioned like this, and they worked like this including in writing the judgment. And so it was a court of 8 in effect throughout this process. This is Jackson speaking. Again, you know the tie, and you know Stu Symington, who you see to the left of the blurry figure, that slow shutter speed camera. This is Jackson delivering the closing argument. This is the table listening to blurry Jackson deliver the closing argument. You can see a younger lawyer got to sit in the empty seat while Jackson was at the podium. And behind Jackson, as you look at it to the left, you see the UK Attorney General, Hartley Shawcross, dark hair, slightly receding at the temple hairline. That is the British Chief of Counsel. So now to the substance. What did Jackson have to say in this closing argument? Well, the genius of the Nuremberg case was that it relied on a backbone of captured Nazi documents. So by the time the case is here for summation, the tribunal has heard presentations by prosecutors. It's received enormous documentation that is unimpeachable because it's authentic, because it's signed by, received by, read by, issued by, written by various of the defendants. It's heard defendants take the stand trying to explain away, I didn't read that, I sign a lot of documents, I didn't know about worse things that others are talking about or other documents indicate, but the evidence was overwhelming. And it was not cooperators who had cut deals, it was not plea bargaining, it was a German captured documents case. And so what Jackson does in his closing argument is, at a high level of generality, summarize across 40 more written pages a detailed, eloquent argument that he had written over a couple of months, summarizing documentary evidence against each of the defendants, explaining their guilt of the overarching crime, which is conspiracy to break treaties and wage aggressive war, and in the war context, commit the battlefield crimes and the human rights crimes that are counts 3 and 4 of the indictment. As I said, not much of the closing argument is captured on film. I'm going to play a little bit in a moment, but there are extensive press reports. Jackson's audience is, of course, the IMT judges, but he's speaking also to these defendants in the box. And this is the full cast. This is Hermann Goering in the lower left corner, and then Hess and Ribbentrop and Keitel and etc. down the first row and down the second row, guarded by American military police wearing the white helmets. Thus, they were nicknamed snowballs. The defendants are watched closely by reporters and spectators as Jackson is delivering his closing argument. They all pay serious attention. None stands up to protest or to interrupt. Some of them take notes. Some smirk, but as it's described, with hatred in their eyes. Hermann Goering, the Reichsmarshal, number 2 to Hitler, pays very close attention. He's very dour and serious, except in the part of the case where Jackson is summarizing the evidence of the economic minister Schacht's guilt. Goering hated Schacht, and Goering loved the summation and smiled broadly when Jackson was summing up the evidence of Schacht's guilt. General Keitel looks bored. The former foreign minister Ribbentrop looks haughty. Most of them don't make eye contact, although Julius Streicher does when Jackson turns to his part of the perpetration and summarizes the evidence. Streicher turns and looks right at Jackson. And in this photograph, Streicher is 8 down in the front row, leaning forward, kind of dark suit, white face. He's looking more or less at the podium. So this captures that Streicher looking at Jackson dynamic that reporters describe. You notice everyone is wearing headphones because this was a multilingual proceeding. There were interpreters in the box who were skilled in pairs of languages. So someone could translate from Jackson's English into Russian, and someone else could translate that into German, and someone else could translate that into French. And each person had headphones at his seat or her seat. There were a few women, and could set the dial on whatever language they wished to hear. So this is Germans listening to the German interpretation of Jackson giving his closing argument in English. I want to turn now to film and show you a few minutes of excerpt. This is from a Court TV 50th anniversary compilation of some of the film of Jackson's closing argument.
And members of the tribunal, an advocate can be confronted with few more formidable tasks than to select his closing arguments where there is great disparity between his appropriate time and his available material. In 8 months, a short time as state trials go, we have introduced evidence which embraces as vast and varied a panorama of events as has ever been compressed within the framework of a litigation. It is impossible in summation to do more than outline with bold strokes the vitals of this trial's mad and melancholy record, which will live as the historical text of the 20th century's shame and depravity. These 20 years in this 20th century will be recorded in the Book of Years as one of the most bloody in all annals. 2 world wars have left a legacy of dead which number more than all the armies engaged in any war that made ancient or medieval history. No half-century ever witnessed slaughter on such a scale. A glance over the dock will show that despite their quarrels among themselves, each defendant played a part which fitted in with every other, and all advanced the common plan. It contradicts experience that men of such diverse backgrounds and talents should so forward each other's aims by coincidence. The large and varied role of Goering was half militarist and half gangster. He stuck a pudgy finger in every pie. He used his SA muscle men to help bring the gang into power. The zealot Hess, before succumbing to wanderlust, was the engineer tending the party machinery, passing orders and propaganda down to the leadership corps, supervising every aspect of party activities, and maintaining the organization as a loyal and ready instrument of power. When apprehensions abroad threatened the success of the Nazi regime for conquest, it was the duplicitous Ribbentrop, the salesman of deception, who was detailed to pour wine on the troubled waters of suspicion by preaching the gospel of limited and peaceful intentions. Keitel, the weak and willing tool, delivered the armed forces, the instrument of aggression, over to the party and directed them in executing its felonious design. Kaltenbrunner, the Grand Inquisitor, took up the bloody mantle of Heydrich to stifle opposition and terrorize compliance, and buttress the power of National Socialism on a foundation of guiltless corpses. Stryker, the venomous vulgarian, manufactured and distributed obscene racial libels, which incited the populace to accept and assist the progressively savage operations of race purification. As Minister of Economics, Funk accelerated the pace of rearmament, and as Reichsbank President, banked for the SS, the gold teeth filling of concentration camp victims, probably the most ghoulish collateral in banking history. It was shocked, the facade of starched respectability, who in the early days provided the window dressing, the bait for the hesitant, and whose wizardry later made it possible for Hitler to finance the colossal rearmament program and to do it secretly. It is against such a background that these defendants now ask his tribunal to say that they are not guilty of planning, executing, or conspiring to commit this long list of crimes and wrongs. They stand before the record of this trial as blood-stained Gloucester stood by the body of his slain king. He begged of the widow, as they beg of you, say I slew them not. And the queen replied, then say they were not slain, but dead they are. If you were to say of these men that they are not guilty, it would be as true to say that there has been no war, that there are no slain, that there has been no crime.
Just doesn't get much.
That's Ricky Kleiman, and she's right. It doesn't get much better than that. Jackson was a deeply eloquent and careful writer and speaker. It shows in his Supreme Court opinions, and it shows in his Nuremberg speeches. He also handled numerous witness examinations, but this closing argument was one where he sort of used his pen probably most intently and most seriously because he regarded this as the most high-stakes thing in his life and career. At the end, you heard him draw from memory from his high school English teacher some words from the play, Shakespeare's play Richard III. And he's there summarizing by analogy the strength of the evidence. The guilt of these Nazis is as clear as the guilt of Gloucester with the dead bodies on the floor in front of him. The tribunal receives this argument on the morning of July 26th. They recess for lunch, and in the afternoon, Hartley Shawcross begins his closing argument for the UK, also beautiful and eloquent. It carries over into the next day. The Soviet chief prosecutor, Roman Rudenko, gives his closing argument. Two lawyers, an aged one in frail health and then a younger one who took over, make the closing argument for the French. And then largely the case is in the hands of the tribunal. It works, the 8 judges, through the month of August and into September, writing a judgment, rendering its conclusion about whether the prosecutors had carried the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt on each of the crimes they had charged against each of the defendants. On September 30 and October 1, 1946, that judgment was rendered publicly. 18 of the 21 individuals who remained in the dock by this end point of the trial were found guilty on at least one of the charges against them. 3, in other words, were acquitted outright, and they were free men at the end of that judgment day. Of the 18, the tribunal found that 11 deserved execution. They were sentenced to death by hanging, and the others were sentenced to terms of years ranging from life down. Only Rudolf Hess, in the end, served a life sentence in Spandau prison, but Albert Speer, for instance, served 20 years in Spandau prison, and that was the accountability process. During this year of the Nuremberg trial, the alliance that had fought and won the war and that remained committed to joint activity through this process of the Nuremberg trial fractured. The Cold War, in effect, began in lots of places, but it includes this room. And so there never was a second international Nuremberg trial. Instead, each nation went its own way in its sector of occupation, and this was the American sector of occupation. So there were subsequent Nuremberg trials, 12 of them, from 1946 to 1949, against second level and not covered sectors from the international trial. The case against the doctors for gruesome medical experimentation, the cases against industrialists, concentration camp cases, judges and lawyers perverting the legal system to create hanging courts under the Nazis. That's the justice case that's portrayed in the film Judgment in Nuremberg. Those were the 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials. And by 1949, the interest, even in the United States, in an accountability process had dwindled. The Cold War was frankly more important, and nurturing an infant West Germany and it being an ally of the West became a priority. And so the Nuremberg project really takes a 50-year hiatus during the Cold War. It's not until the late 1980s with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then the early 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union and visible atrocities in Yugoslavia and in Rwanda, that finds an international community consensus again, as there had been in 1945, to work together for accountability through international law. And thus, a number of standalone tribunals are created: the Yugoslavia Tribunal, the Rwanda Tribunal, and the Rome Treaty creating the International Criminal Court is first written and then ratified by a sufficient number of nations to bring that body, the world's permanent International Criminal Court, into being in 2002. Not every nation is a signatory or a participant in that process. Ironically, the United States and the USSR, two of the leading architects of this IMT process at Nuremberg, are not part of the ICC process, nor is China, nor is Israel. The consensus and shared assessment that it is in our national interest of 1945 and even of 1992 and 1993 is not currently there with regard to the International Criminal Court. But what Nuremberg did was two things. It put down the marker that international law prescribes these acts, including up to the head of state level, and it documented with the evidentiary record what the Nazis had done. Without the Nuremberg trial, this Nuremberg trial, we would not have unimpeachable evidence that has allowed modern decades to understand and study and teach the Holocaust. It would be a debated point. We would not have a full understanding of what the Third Reich did. And so the Nuremberg trial deserves what Robert Jackson sort of thought it was at the time: the ranking of an enormously important, permanently consequential task. For your homework, if you will, I do encourage you to read all of Jackson's closing argument. This only scratches the surface, and the video makes only a small portion of it available. You can find the full text online in many places, one of which is the Avalon Project at Yale Law School. If you click into 20th Century and Nuremberg Trials and go to this day, July 26, you will find the transcript of Jackson and then Shawcross and the full proceedings. It is an eloquent, full, fascinating, horrifying catalog of evidence against these individual defendants. And of course, as Thorin said, if you're interested and not already on the Jackson list, you can find it at that URL. Just Google Jackson list or send me an email. I write 2 or 3 notes a month, and I would welcome your interest, and I appreciate you spreading the word. I'll pause now, and I hope there are some questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Professor Barrett. Really very grateful for your comments. There are a number of questions that have already come in. They've been coming in as you've been talking, and let me run through a few, if I may, with you. To start with, just some background about what did other nations think about the military tribunal? Was it highly regarded at the time, before the completion, when it was underway, or when it was being planned? Was it something that other nations saw as a model activity, or were there criticisms of it?
I think generally it was a part of this golden moment of consensus. There was a world war and the world won, is one way to think about 1945. And this is a birth moment, not just of the London Agreement creating the IMT, but the United Nations, which had been created earlier that summer, and international conventions that follow in those next couple of years, the Geneva Conventions, the Genocide Convention. The London Agreement is actually not just a 4-nation agreement, but has almost 20 more nations that subscribe to it. And by the end of 1946, it is by acclamation endorsed by the United Nations. So virtually every nation on the face of the earth subscribes to it. There is no Germany at the moment of 1945, 1946. And the German people, to the extent they were still believers in Nazism, were not fans of this proceeding. To the extent that they were desperate, living in rubble and trying not to starve in the aftermath of the war, they didn't think much of this effort, and they would have preferred the international community giving them more direct relief. But by and large, this was a global project and admired at the global level.
There's also some questions just about wondering how equal the process was for the various countries, for the 4 countries who were involved as the judges. Did each have an equal vote? Was each equally involved in the kind of setting up and the processing, or was this American-led or some other nation-led?
It was, no question, American-led. The sort of first among equals was the U.S. In going first, in appointing Jackson. Jackson is the chief prosecutor of the chief prosecutors. But the prosecutors as a cohort were all strong. Hartley, Shawcross, Roman, Rudenko, and they functioned as a committee of chief prosecutors and then divvied up responsibility. Similarly, the judges, the 4 principals and the 4 alternates, the bench of 8, were strong. They had varying degrees of independence. The Soviet judges were much more supervised and controlled from Moscow. The American judges were sort of free and independent judges on our notion of judicial independence, and I think the British and French were that type also. But they each were part of everything. They were sharing all drafts, dividing responsibility, and voting. And you see it a bit in the judgment. The rules of the IMT require at least 3 to convict and 3 to impose any sentences. And so on a number of the acquittals, the Russian judge dissents. The other 3 nations acquitted. On a number of the non-death sentences, the Russian judge dissents, but couldn't get the additional votes to send someone to the gallows. So, you know, there's national prerogative and sovereignty being surrendered, but also national perspective being exercised quite equally, I would say, in the tribunal.
Somebody raises the point that there were no German lawyers or judges involved. And to what degree did that give the impression, or maybe was a representation, of the fact that the trial was kind of victor's justice?
Yeah, I mean, descriptively, that's accurate. It was victor's justice. That's also used as a critique, as if there was a good alternative. And that's something that the Allies, particularly Jackson, who took a lot of notes and left a paper trail, did worry about. But there wasn't a good alternative. There wasn't a Germany. There wasn't a surviving, independent, resistance judiciary prosecution in Germany. There were people who had become refugees and gotten out alive, and some like Robert Kempner, who I pointed to in one of the photographs, came back and became parts of the prosecution effort. But there wasn't a sort of honest court in Germany that could have done this. And so the Allies needed to constitute something. The German participation was the defense lawyers, and some of them were unrepentant Nazis. And I think it is to the Allies' credit that they let the Nazis select Nazi lawyers to give their best true believer and subordinate, and our law was obedience to Hitler, account of why they shouldn't be convicted. And so they were able to defend themselves with full German assistance. But yes, there was no German judge, and yes, there was no non-immigrant, if you will, German prosecutor.
There's some questions that have also come up about the evidence, and you mentioned that there were troves of documents that the Allies had acquired and found, and they used that. But was there forensic evidence? What kind of other things could you say about the evidence? Somebody asks about whether DNA evidence, if it had existed at the time, would have done more. Maybe for the people who were acquitted, was it because of an evidence-based concern, or was it just that the judges ruled that they were acquitted because of other facts?
There's a lot in those questions. As to evidence, it was largely 2 types. Overwhelmingly documentary, and that was all translated into multiple languages and exhibit books and reading trial briefs into the record, and then a lot of disputation about whether documents had been translated properly and so forth. But you know, these were the records. These were Goering commands and etc. Plus, there was live witness testimony, both in the prosecution cases and, of course, in the defense cases. The live witnesses were particularly significant in the French case, which was about occupation and crimes in the West by the Nazis, and in the Soviet case, which was about occupation and crimes in the East by the Nazis. So these were Holocaust cases. And some survivors were live witnesses, victim witnesses, if you will, and gave very powerful testimony that began the process of understanding what that extermination plan, design, and system was about. In addition, there was a small amount of film evidence that was used, both captured German films of the Nazis in their heyday, if you will, showing the planning, the agreement, the speeches before the Reichstag, etc., and American liberator film of concentration camps in the West, German concentration camps. There was, of course, not liberator film of extermination camps in the East, because the Nazis tried to plow those under and retreat ahead of the advancing Soviet forces. But there was some of that film evidence too. There was not DNA evidence. Our science was not at that point in 1945. Maybe some DNA identification would have been a contribution if the science had existed, but I'm not sure that there was a gap that would have filmed. And then there were a couple of quite gruesome physical evidence objects that were part of the evidence. For example, some shrunken human heads and other things showing torture, extermination, and atrocity.
There's some questions about some other people who weren't at this trial. For example,
could I go back? You also asked in that multi-parted question about the acquitted defendants and whether that was based on evidentiary problems. The three people who were acquitted, remember it took 3 to convict. So by 2-2 votes, these were acquitted, were Helmar Schacht, the economic minister, Franz von Papen, who was a diplomat, and ultimately the chancellor early as Hitler was taking power, and Hans Fritzsche, who was a radio propagandist and really sort of a stand-in for Joseph Goebbels. And they were acquitted. There's wonderful scholarship, and the tribunal kept quite detailed records of its deliberations, so you can kind of trace it. Schacht was acquitted largely because he had broken with Hitler by the end of the build-up phase and really was not part of the leadership during the war. Now, financing the violation of the Versailles Treaty and building up the army and preparing for the war was his economic wizardry. But then he became an enemy of the Reich, and indeed, at the end of the war, he was a prisoner in Dachau, which for a defense attorney is what they call a good fact. And so that separation was enough for 2 judges to vote to acquit Schacht. Papen, I think, got a kind of old age consideration. He was really also quite out to pasture by the war years, 1939 and forward. So although he had been an important leader, figurehead, deliberating policymaker, and then ambassador, he was kind of out to pasture and not at the center of war making and other decision making, 1939 and forward. And Fritzsche was acquitted because he was a small fish. Yes, he was a radio propagandist, but he really was not a big deal and not a policymaker. He was a voice on the radio, but not Joseph Goebbels or anything close to it. Indeed, when Fritzsche was first, he was a Russian prisoner. And really one of the reasons he got charged was that the Russians wanted some of their prisoners to be charged. Most of these defendants had come from American or British custody in the West. But the Russians said, we have the arch criminal Fritzsche, which first led the other allies to say, remind us who Fritzsche is. And then when Fritzsche got to Nuremberg, it was like a kid getting to go to an all-star game. He was meeting all his big Nazi heroes, his fellow defendants for the first time. And they also said, who are you? Who's Fritzsche? And basically the tribunal said, like, who's Fritzsche? And that was the one acquittal that even for Robert Jackson as the prosecutor, who thought he carried his burden of proof, didn't sting. Papen stung. Schacht stung a lot. Fritzsche was a bit of he doesn't really rank up here with what this trial is about.
That's interesting. Some of the other people other names that people are asking about are Hitler and Goebbels. Would they have been in a separate trial? Would they have been in this trial? I guess that's a counterfactual, but, and then others, why wasn't Eichmann in this? Or how did they choose the defendants?
Right. So if everyone was alive and captured at the end of the war, the Allies had this commitment and would have done something together, and I assume it would have evolved into a trial rather than a firing squad, and that somebody like Robert Jackson would have insisted on a fair, open, burden of proof, independent judiciary, defense counsel process. But I think they wouldn't have cluttered up a Hitler trial with very many other defendants. So again, counterfactual and total guesswork, but a Hitler trial maybe has 2, 3, 4 other defendants like Goebbels and like Himmler and Bormann and Goering, and maybe that's it. And maybe it would have been quicker. Eichmann was the head of the Jewish office in the Reich Main Security Office and was known by the summer of 1945 because the documents showed that he was a very important decision maker. Basically, the function of the extermination camps in the East was an architecture that he supervised. And then in 1944, he personally went to Hungary and supervised the deportation of the Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz and other camps in the East where hundreds of thousands of them were exterminated. So Eichmann was known to be a desk criminal and a field criminal of enormous significance. But all the evidence as of the summer of 1945 indicated that he was dead. There were kind of hearsay reports that he'd committed suicide. They didn't have a body, of course, and he wasn't dead. But there wasn't a sense that he was a fugitive. Others were believed to be fugitives and they were looking for them. For example, the commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss, was somebody who was captured by the British during this trial, too late to become a defendant. And maybe he wasn't an arch criminal because his crimes occurred at Auschwitz. But he was brought to Nuremberg, ended up testifying, ended up giving incredibly damning evidence about what Auschwitz was and what he did there as the commandant. And then he was handed over to the Poles, who tried him at Auschwitz in 1947 and convicted him and hanged him right there in Auschwitz.
We only have time for a couple more questions, so let me try and get to a couple of these. One is, one person raises the question about, did any of the countries recognize their hypocrisy in not speaking up and doing more to combat the Holocaust while it was happening, and then to hold those accountable for the Holocaust at this trial? Am I capturing a question that you can make sense of?
Yeah, sort of remorse, apology, no. I think the Allied perspective was that they had fought and defeated and won this war, and in the course of it, stopped the horrors that the Nazis were perpetrating. Yeah. They also did not, going into it, fully comprehend the enormity of what that was. So yes, there's a degree of knowledge on the front end. There's, of course, film and soldiers who have liberated Dachau and other camps in Germany, but understanding what Auschwitz, Sobibor, Treblinka were is not a clear thing in the minds of the Allies at the start of this process, at the end of the war. Indeed, Jackson is first told that the Nazis have killed almost 6 million Jews in June of 1945 by a member of the Jewish organizations, Jacob Robinson, who is one of his important advisors. And Jackson is flabbergasted and says, like, what's that based on? I've never heard such an enormous number. Now, this is Jackson in the US, but a Supreme Court justice, and he's close to a lot of people in the center of the action. And Jacob Robinson says it's based on 2 numbers: the population of Jews in Europe pre-Nazis, and the numbers of persons now in displaced person camps and ordinary birth death show a missing increment of about 6 million Jews. So they must have been murdered. And Jackson says, well, that's, an incredibly horrible allegation, but that's not evidence. Like, get me proof, get me evidence. And between June, when he hears that, and November, when he's starting the trial, a lot of proof, witness statements, documents, etc., are being developed. Does that cause any Allied leader to kind of look backwards and say, we should have figured this out earlier and we should have done something different in 44, 43, 42? Not in this courtroom, not in this trial process.
2 last questions. One is about what was the response to Justice Jackson's closing arguments in the press, both in Germany and the United States. And a second kind of follow-up was later on, when some of the people who were found guilty had their sentences commuted. How did Justice Jackson respond to that?
The response to Jackson's closing in July of 1946 is very admiring and positive. There were bumpy stretches during the trial, but this is succeeding. And back to the victor's justice point, the fact that it is succeeding as a prosecutorial, the evidence is showing the guilt, is gratifying to the people in the Allied nations who have fought this enemy and won this war. There's a little bit of vengeance that is being sated by the success of this prosecutor, plus his eloquence, his stature, the sort of visible fairness, not marching the Nazis out and immediately summarily executing them, but giving them a chance to, as he put it, have the fair trial that they never gave a single one of their enemies, opponents, or victims, is pleasing, is gratifying. And so, that's the reaction in the time, and I think that admiration, continues through the judgment and through the end of the trial. Your other question was?
About the commutation of some of the sentences later on?
Yeah, so the commutations are sort of two batches, if you will. The defendants in this trial who are convicted, who don't go to the gallows, go to Spandau prison. And a couple of them do get commutations based on ill health, but that happens after Jackson is dead. Jackson dies in 1954, so 8 years afterwards, and he didn't react to those. But I think, a sick old man going home to die, probably even these sick old criminal men, wouldn't have been something Jackson much objected to. He regarded punishment as the court's business, not his as a prosecutor. The other commutations were people convicted in the subsequent 12 American trials who were then incarcerated in Landsberg prison in Bavaria, not too far from Nuremberg. And they were pardoned and paroled out by an American process. And Jackson was a spectator to that, but thought it was outrageous. He, privately communicated with his deputy here, one of his deputies here, Telford Taylor, who became the chief prosecutor in those cases, about the commutations, and others who continued to be involved, like Robert Kempner. And he thought that this was political calculation that was a mistaken one, that, sort of letting bygones be bygones and helping the German people forget about the past so as to be in the West, a Federal Republic of Germany that would be a good Western ally, was too much of a price to pay and a wrong calculation. But by that point, Jackson is back on the Supreme Court, and it's not his job to mouth off about that, and he did not.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for answering all these questions. And there are more, but we really don't have time for them. But I think you have sparked a sincere interest, and I trust there'll be some new members of the Jackson list coming on shortly. So thank you very much.
Great questions, and it was a real pleasure to be part of this program. I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, everybody, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.